In the last lecture, I outlined what I believe are the broad advantages of cumulative syntax, focusing both on the clarity of logical relations this syntax establishes among parts of sentences and on the ebb and flow rhythms it promotes, almost guaranteeing that cumulative prose will appeal to the ear. Perhaps most important, I showed how the cumulative syntax functions heuristically, prompting writers to make sentences more satisfying and effective by adding detail and explanation in free modifying phrases. The cumulative is, as Francis Christensen suggested, a generative syntax in the sense that it encourages writers to add information to their sentences, relying on free modifying phrases after the base clause, each new phrase a step forward for the sentence, each new phrase sharpening the sentence by adding new details or offering clarification or explanation for propositions advanced in the base clause or preceding modifying phrase. One useful way of thinking of this feature of the cumulative is to see each new modifying phrase as answering a question that a reader might have about the preceding clause or phrase. Thus, if we start with a base clause, "he was afraid," we might well expect a reader to wonder who he is and why he might be afraid. Both questions anticipated and answered by adding free modifying phrases that would give us the sentence, "He was afraid, a little boy separated from his mother in a large department store, fearing that he would never find her, feeling lost and abandoned in a world of strange and scary faces." Now, my assumption here is that most of us start thinking about our sentences with fairly simple subject-verb base clauses or kernel sentences that might not be as stark as "he was afraid," but are very rarely as developed as "he was afraid, a little boy separated from his mother in a large department store, fearing that he would never find her, feeling lost and abandoned in a world of strange and scary faces." In this and subsequent lectures, I'll continue to try to point out the many reasons why I think cumulative syntax is the greatest thing since sliced bread and the surest way for writers to immediately improve the effectiveness of their sentences. But first, we need to backtrack just a bit and be sure we understand the technical aspects of cumulative syntax. I'm going to try to keep grammatical descriptions to a minimum here, but I will need to review some grammar to help us distinguish cumulative sentences from those that are not cumulative. So for the next few minutes, you may feel like you're back in a 9th or 10th grade English class, but odds are that 9th or 10th grade English class was never this useful. I know mine weren't, and I deeply regret that I was not introduced to the cumulative sentence until I was in grad school. So, here goes. A cumulative sentence gets its name from the fact that it accumulates information, gathering new details as it goes, like a snowball that gets bigger and bigger and bigger as you roll it through snow. To write a cumulative sentence, all you have to do is turn the period at the end of one of your sentences into a comma and start adding modifiers. As you add modifying details, you will bring your writing into focus, making your point sharper and sharper, your meaning more and more clear. A cumulative sentence has two main parts. The first part is called the base clause. A base clause contains the sentence's main subject and main verb. A base clause can be thought of as a short, boiled-down sentence. For example, the boy fainted. The verb in a base clause is called a finite verb. Verbs express an action or state of being. State of being verbs are also called linking verbs. An action verb expresses something that can be done. A linking verb points to more information. That is, it must be followed by another word that completes its information. True linking verbs include all forms of state of being verbs, and state of being verbs include all the forms of the verb be. These are heavily used in our writing, as in he is, I am, we are, it was, they were, it has been, we might have been, I will become, it seems, and so on. Now you'll notice that none of the above combinations of a subject and a linking verb offer any really useful information. That's because each linking verb needs a verb complement that explains the specific nature of a particular state of being. Thus, he is hungry, I am eating, we are singing, it has been educational, I seem to have lost my billfold, and so on. Forms of be state of being verbs are almost always linking verbs, although very rarely they can function independently, signaling being as existence, as in, I think, therefore I am. But we also have a group of verbs that can function either as linking verbs needing a complement to complete their meaning, or that can function independently as action verbs. The context of the sentence, the way they function in the sentence, will determine whether they are action or linking verbs. There are too many of these multitasking verbs to list, but the category includes such verbs as appear, which can be used interchangeably with the linking verb seem, or feel, which can be used in many cases as we might use the linking verb am, I am sick, or I feel sick, and so on. A number of verbs in this category are very close to linking verbs in meaning. For example, verbs such as remain or continue clearly can refer to states of being, but can function independently as action verbs, as in the building remains or the drama continues. Action verbs also can be subdivided into those that need an object to complete their meaning and those that do not. If the verb requires, or even if it just can be used with a direct object, we call it a transitive verb. If the verb cannot take a direct object, we call it an intransitive verb. Here's some examples. The boy fainted, action verb, intransitive. The boy is tired, linking verb. The boy kicked the ball, action verb, transitive. There are almost an infinite number of both kinds of verbs, and many verbs can function either intransitively, as in he eats or he is eating, or transitively, as in he eats lasagna or he is eating lunch. Now, so much for the base clause. The second part of a cumulative sentence consists of one or more modifying phrases. Unlike a clause, a phrase does not contain a subject and a verb, and it cannot stand alone as a sentence. Here's some examples of phrases. His face turning white. A goofy-looking sixth grader. Muscles turning to jelly. Most modifying phrases can be classified as participial phrases, gerund phrases, infinitive phrases, or prepositional phrases. Participial phrases are particularly important for cumulative sentences, and we'll consider them more fully in just a moment. To start with, however, going back to those four categories of phrases, participial phrases contain a verb that has been turned into an adjective. For example, the boy fainted, exhausted by his long run. Or, the boy fainted, fainting as if he had been shot. Or, the boy fainted, slumping to the ground. Or, the boy fainted, stricken with grief. The boy fainted, lost for the rest of the race. The boy fainted, his face turning a sickly white. Now, for the second kind of phrase, gerund phrases are somewhat similar to participial phrases, with the difference that they contain a verb that's been turned into a noun. Eating ice cream too fast makes my forehead hurt. Eating ice cream too fast is what I always try to avoid. His eating ice cream proved to be his undoing. In much the same way that a participle is a verb drained of power, a gerund is a verb that has been turned into a noun by adding ing to a verb and using it as we use a noun to name a person, place, or thing. Just as a noun functions, a gerund can be the subject of a sentence, the direct object of the verb in a sentence, a subject complement, or the object of a preposition. Here's some examples. First of all, gerund is subject. Cheating might become a habit. Now, gerund as direct object. They do not understand my cheating. Gerund as subject complement. My biggest problem is cheating. Or gerund as object of a preposition. The coach chewed him out for cheating. Gerunds can serve in cumulative modifying phrases as appositives, substitutes for previous nouns or pronouns, and they can serve in combination with participles, as in, fainting having become something of a problem for troops in formation, the general tried to finish his inspection as quickly as possible. Now, infinitive phrases. The boy wanted to faint. Fainting is the problem to be overcome. To faint or not to faint was the question. Infinitives function much like gerunds and frequently appear in cumulative modifying levels accompanied by a participle. Thinking he needed to find a job, the ex-superhero started scouring the want ads. And finally, prepositional phrases. The boy fainted after finishing the race. The boy fainted as his shocked parents watched. The boy fainted in front of his parents, or the boy fainted with no warning. Common prepositions that begin prepositional phrases are across, after, as, at, because of, before, between, by, for, from, in front of, in regard to, like, near, of, on, over, through, to, together with, under, until, up, and with. The crucial point here is that all four kinds of phrases can appear as steps in cumulative sentences, but it is crucial that these phrases contain verbals and not active or passive verbs. We might think of verbals as verbs light, or as verbs drained of their power to make anything happen, serving only to modify something. Now, back to participial phrases. Since participles are in effect adjectives made from verbs, participial phrases function in a sentence in all the ways an adjective might function, primarily modifying nouns or pronouns. Participles that refer to ongoing actions or processes are called present participles. Participles that refer to past or completed actions or processes are called past participles. Present participles end in ing. Past participles can take more forms, but generally are verbs that can function as verbals in their forms ending in d, ed, en, t, or n, as in the words confused, marked, eaten, recovered, dealt, and written. Here's some examples. The boy slumped to the floor, dropping his books. Dropping is a present participle. The boy slumped to the floor, scared witless by what he saw. scared is a past participle. The boy slumped to the floor, driven past his physical limits, another past participle. Modifying phrases may add information about the subject or the verb of the base clause, or the object if it contains an object, or they may simply add to our understanding of the entire base clause. Example, the boy kicked the ball, hitting it squarely with the toe of his soccer shoe. Another example, the boy kicked the ball, a tattered and worn old football. The boy kicked the ball, grim determination clear in his every move. The boy kicked the ball, his friends yelling their encouragement. So, base clause plus modifying phrases makes a cumulative sentence. And we get as a result something like, the boy fainted, a goofy-looking sixth grader, his face turning white, muscles turning to jelly, dropping his books, uttering a kind of pained squeak, scared witless by what he saw. Now, this cumulative sentence packs a lot of information. Indeed, when we unpack its underlying propositions, we see that it does the work of at least 7 different sentences. Number 1, the boy fainted. Number 2, the boy was a goofy-looking sixth grader. Number 3, when he fainted, the boy's face turned white. Number 4, when he fainted, the boy's muscle turned to jelly. 5, when he fainted, the boy dropped his books. 6, when he fainted, the boy uttered a kind of pained squeak. And 7, the boy fainted because he was scared witless by what he saw. Because the cumulative sentence does pack so much detail, and because it is easy to follow, professional writers use it very frequently. In fact, it has been estimated that professional writers put their modifiers at the end of their sentences 2/3 of the time. Okay, that was a basic description of cumulative syntax. I've actually used that description to try to explain the cumulative to students in a junior high class, without much success, I have to admit. But I also use it in my prose style class at Iowa, frequently discovering that my English majors have never been taught the difference between a clause and a phrase. Now, that distinction is crucial, since students trying to write cumulatives for the first time often produce comma splices, following the base clause with a comma, but then adding another base clause rather than a modifying phrase. Thus, instead of getting the cumulative sentence, the boy fainted, his face turning white, we get something like, the boy fainted, his face turned white, which is called a comma splice, because a comma is simply not a strong enough mark of punctuation to join together 2 base clauses. The crucial difference between these 2 sentences is that the cumulative sentence follows the subject and verb of the base clause with a verbal and a modifying phrase. To stay with the example I started with, the boy fainted, his face turning white. Now, the difference between his face turned white and his face turning white becomes pretty clear when we remember that his face turned white could stand alone as a sentence in its own right, a sure sign that it is a clause, while his face turning white cannot stand alone as a sentence, a sure sign that it is a phrase. Now, let's try to think about the technical aspects of the cumulative sentence in somewhat more sophisticated terms. As I noted in the last lecture, the philosophy of the cumulative sentence was codified by Francis Christensen in his A Generative Rhetoric of the Sentence, first published in College Composition and Communication in October 1963. But Christensen credited novelist John Erskine with inspiring this philosophy in a 1946 essay published in 20th Century English. That essay, entitled A Note on the Writer's Craft, directly challenged the simple and direct school of composition that stressed the paring down of writing and championed modification instead. As I noted in the last lecture, Erskine took the unique tack of arguing, quote, "When you write, you make a point not by subtracting as though you sharpened a pencil, but by adding," end of quote. And this insight led him to his radical conclusion that, quote, "the modifier is the essential part of any sentence," end of quote. With its emphasis on modifying phrases, the cumulative sentence might be thought of as a major kind of adjectival sentence, to use the terms suggested by Josephine Miles. The main feature of this sentence pattern is that it packages modifiers as unbound words or phrases, that is, in ways that will usually allow them to appear in the sentence in different positions, rather than bound to the word or words they modify. In this way, the cumulative modifying phrase may open, close, or appear in the middle of the sentence. For example, given boy as the object of modification and crying loudly as the modifying phrase, we might construct a sentence with that phrase in the initial slot. Crying loudly, the boy left. The final slot, the boy left, crying loudly. Or the medial slot, the boy, crying loudly, left. As I previously noted, some writing scholars, such as Virginia Tufte, describe the positioning of modifying phrases as left branching or right branching. If the modifying phrase comes before the base clause or to the left of it on the page, it's called a left branching sentence. If the modifying phrase comes after the base clause or to the right of it on the page, it is called a right branching sentence. And if the modifying phrase comes in the middle of the base clause, it is called mid-branching. But what's important here is not the terminology, but that a free modifying phrase can be placed in each of these three positions. That's the point of calling them free modifiers. They are free to be moved around. And they are free to be mixed and matched, since we can write cumulative sentences that feature modifying phrases in all three positions at once. For example, having cleared customs, the elegantly dressed old man, a gleeful smile on his face, hailed a cab, instructing its driver to take him to the nearest casino. It is important to note, however, that cumulative sentences featuring modifying phrases in the initial or medial positions carry a couple of risks. Initial modifying phrases run the risk of becoming misplaced modifiers. We have a misplaced modifier, sometimes called a dangling modifier or a dangling participle, when the modifying phrase doesn't match up with what it tells about. I bet more than a few of us remember the classic example of a misplaced modifier. Having eaten lunch, the bus left the station. Now, obviously, the bus did not eat lunch, but that's what this sentence suggests. The problem is that the modifying phrase doesn't really have a logical object of modification in the base clause. People eat lunch. Buses don't. More specifically, the people who were riding on the bus ate lunch. But the base clause, the bus left the station, doesn't mention people, doesn't mention bus riders, doesn't mention anyone who could conceivably eat anything. What this sentence fails to do is to provide logical agents who could be modified by the phrase having eaten lunch. In other words, the base clause lacks any clue to who did the eating. Now, once we figure out that the sentence fails to provide a logical object of modification for the modifying phrase, we realize that the term that is usually applied to this mistake, misplaced modifier, is itself not really correct. Misplaced suggests that the sentence can be corrected simply by moving the modifying phrase to the correct or logical place in the sentence. But no such place exists. The bus left the station having eaten lunch doesn't make a bit more sense, nor does the bus, having eaten lunch, left the station. The problem with this sentence is not placement of the modifying phrase, but is that there's nothing for that phrase to modify. So, to clean this sentence up, we would need to add a word or phrase to the base clause that would provide an object of modification, or in the terms I've suggested, that might provide something that the modifying phrase can answer a question about. In this case, who ate lunch? Consequently, a satisfying and logical cumulative sentence might read, after the passengers ate lunch, the bus left the station. Remember, a misplaced or dangling modifier is a word or phrase that modifies a word not clearly stated in the sentence. These modifiers aren't actually misplaced. They need something to modify. Frequently, a misplaced modifier modifies an agent, someone doing something, but that agent is not specified in the sentence. For example, after running the race so well, fainting was a disappointment. Cumulative sentences are all about specificity, and both the agents responsible for action in a cumulative sentence and the objects of action must be clearly identified. We need to know who it was that fainted. Having forgetfully left his backpack in the restaurant, his absent-mindedness caused his friends to make fun of him. Or, having forgetfully left his backpack in the restaurant, the hapless freshman invited the ridicule of his friends. In the first sentence, there's no clear indication of who or what is performing the action expressed in the participial phrase, having forgetfully left his backpack in the restaurant. Having forgetfully left can't logically modify his or his absent-mindedness or his forgetfulness or anything else. And since there is no clearly specified object for having forgetfully left his backpack to modify, we call this a misplaced modifier or a dangling modifier. And we might think of dangling modifiers as a participial phrase that's all dressed up with no place to go, since there's nothing specifically present in the sentence for it to point to. Now, so-called misplaced modifiers can occur anywhere in the sentence, but for some reason I don't understand starting a sentence with an initial modifying phrase or left-branching sentences seems to particularly lead writers to make this mistake. So whenever you begin a sentence with a modifying phrase, be sure that the base clause contains a word or words that phrase can logically modify, and if possible, put that object of modification as close to the start of the base clause as possible. And there's also a risk we need to be aware of when we put modifying phrases in the medial position, usually interposing them between the subject of the base clause and its verb. If we only separate subject from verb by a single modifying word or phrase, there's no problem. However, if we start dumping modifying phrases in the middle of a base clause, we run the risk of either making the sentence hard to follow or of transforming it into a suspensive sentence where delaying its completion becomes the dominant aspect, sacrificing the strong sense of cumulative movement for a sense that the sentence is putting off whatever may be at its end, either to build suspense or to add maximum emphasis to its final word. Here's an example of what can happen. The bus, an ancient yellow relic, a vehicle so old and undependable that even our strapped-for-cash school district would no longer use it, a monument to questionable design in its beginnings and to poor maintenance near the end of its service, left the station. Whew. Now, there's nothing really wrong with that sentence, and it is grammatically cumulative. But its cumulative modifying phrases add motion with no movement. Its rhythm somehow stuck, and the reason for using cumulative form not at all clear. To sum up, the cumulative sentence is most typical and probably appears most frequently when the modifying phrase or phrases appear in the final position, since the whole idea behind the cumulative sentence is that it quickly posits a somewhat stark or kernel-like base clause, subject and verb, subject, verb, object, then presents much more information about that base clause in subsequent modifying phrases. For example, they drank their coffees, the old man downing his in one quick gulp, spilling several drops on his faded shirt, the finely dressed young woman nursing hers along quite slowly, carefully raising and lowering the cup to her lips as if it contained nitroglycerin rather than coffee, a stiffly mechanical process that suggested her nervousness more than her control. We've seen that cumulative modifying phrases can start a sentence, can interrupt a base clause by coming between the subject and the verb, or can follow the base clause. And of course, there's no reason why a single cumulative sentence can't use modifying phrases in all three positions. And remember, to give any sentence more of a cumulative form, simply replace its period with a comma and start adding modifying phrases. Just like that, you're on your way.